This is my true story. When I lost my job at 68, my younger brother offered me a place to stay. Within weeks, I became their servant, cleaning toilets, scrubbing floors, doing laundry. His wife called me worthless. His children laughed. For 5 years, they treated me like I was nothing. Last month, I collapsed while cleaning their toilet. They didn't visit me in the hospital. 3 weeks later, I disappeared from their lives forever. But when the lawyer called them in for a meeting, their faces went white. What they learned destroyed everything. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. My younger brother Richard and I grew up in the same small house with the same parents. We had the same opportunities growing up, went to the same schools, had the same advantages and disadvantages. But our lives took very different paths. Richard was always ambitious, always focused on money and success, always wanted more than what we had. He went to business school, got into real estate development, started buying properties and flipping them for profit. I took a different path. I loved books and learning. I became a librarian. It wasn't a glamorous career. It didn't pay well. But I enjoyed it. I spent 40 years working at the public library in our town, helping people find books, running reading programs for children, organizing community events. It was meaningful work, even if it wasn't profitable. I lived simply on my modest salary. Small apartment, used car, no luxuries. But I was content. Richard's ambition paid off in ways I never imagined. He built a real estate empire over the decades. Started with small properties, worked his way up to major commercial developments, shopping centers, office buildings, apartment complexes. His company grew into one of the most successful real estate firms in the state. He became genuinely wealthy, not just comfortable, but rich. The kind of wealth where money stops being a concern. By the time we were both in our 60s, Richard was living in a mansion. Not just a big house, but an actual estate. 8 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, swimming pool, tennis court, 3-car garage filled with luxury vehicles. He had a Mercedes. His wife Amanda had a BMW. Their children drove expensive cars too. Everything about their lifestyle screamed wealth and success. They took vacations to Europe, wore designer clothes, ate at expensive restaurants. Money was no object for them. Meanwhile, I was still living in my small 2-bedroom apartment, still driving my 15-year-old Honda, still shopping at discount grocery stores and clipping coupons. My salary as a librarian had never been high. Even after 40 years, I was only making about $45,000 a year. After taxes and basic expenses, I had little left over. I couldn't afford luxuries, could barely afford necessities sometimes. But I managed. I lived within my means. Richard and I stayed in touch over the years, but we weren't close. Our lives were too different. We'd see each other at family gatherings, talk on the phone occasionally, but we didn't have much in common anymore. He was focused on business deals and wealth accumulation. I was focused on books and community service. We drifted apart, become strangers who happened to share blood. Our parents died when I was 66 and Richard was 63. They'd been in declining health for years. When they finally passed, it wasn't a surprise. Richard handled most of the funeral arrangements because he could afford it. I helped where I could, but didn't have money to contribute much. The estate was small. Our parents had been working-class people who'd saved what they could, but didn't have much to leave behind. What little there was got split between Richard and me. I got maybe $20,000. Richard didn't even need his share. It was nothing to him. 2 years after our parents died, I lost my job. The library I'd worked at for 40 years faced major budget cuts. The city was struggling financially. They had to make hard choices. As one of the oldest employees with the highest salary, I was an easy target for cuts. They let me go at age 68, gave me a small severance package, and thanked me for my decades of service. Then I was unemployed with no real prospects for finding another job. At 68 years old, nobody wants to hire you, especially not for library positions that younger people with master's degrees were competing for. I applied for jobs anyway. Library assistant positions, bookstore clerk jobs, anything related to books. But I never got callbacks. I was too old, too expensive, too close to retirement age. Employers didn't want to invest in training someone who'd only work a few years before retiring. My savings were minimal. I'd never made enough to save substantially. The severance package would last maybe 6 months if I was careful. After that, I didn't know what I'd do. Applying for Social Security would help, but it wouldn't be enough to cover my apartment rent and basic living expenses. I was facing the very real possibility of homelessness. At 68 years old, I was about to lose everything. That's when Richard reached out. He'd heard through family connections that I'd lost my job. He called me one evening, said he'd been thinking about our parents, about what they would have wanted. He said family should take care of family, that I shouldn't be struggling when he had so much. He offered to let me move into his estate, said he had plenty of room, that I could live there rent-free, that I wouldn't have to worry about expenses. I was overwhelmed by his generosity. I'd never expected help from Richard. We'd never been that close. But here he was, offering me a home when I desperately needed one. I thanked him profusely, said I didn't want to be a burden. He insisted it was no burden at all, that he wanted to help his brother, that this was what family did. I accepted gratefully. I had no other options, no backup plan, no way to support myself long-term on my savings and eventual Social Security. I gave up my apartment, sold most of my belongings since Richard said I wouldn't need much, packed what little I wanted to keep into my car. Then I drove to Richard's mansion, ready to start this new chapter of my life. I was grateful and relieved. Grateful to have a place to live, relieved that I wouldn't end up homeless. I thought Richard was being kind, thought he genuinely wanted to help me. I had no idea what I was actually walking into. The first few days at Richard's estate were actually pleasant. He and Amanda showed me to my room. It was nice, bigger than my entire apartment had been. It had its own bathroom, a comfortable bed, a desk and chair, windows overlooking their garden. They told me to make myself at home, to settle in, to rest after the stress of losing my job. I thought maybe this arrangement would actually work, that I could live here peacefully as part of the family. But the pleasantness lasted less than a week. The first request came from Amanda during breakfast. She mentioned they were having guests over for dinner that evening. She asked if I could help clean up after since she'd be tired from cooking. I said of course. It seemed like a reasonable request. I was living there rent-free. Helping with dishes after a dinner party was the least I could do. So that evening I stayed after dinner and cleaned the kitchen, washed all the dishes, wiped down the counters, put everything away. Amanda thanked me sweetly, said I was so helpful, said it was nice having someone around who could pitch in. I felt good about helping, felt like I was earning my keep, contributing something even though I couldn't pay rent. The next day, Amanda asked if I could vacuum the living room since she had friends coming over. Again, I agreed. It took maybe 30 minutes. Seemed like a fair exchange for having a free place to live. The requests started coming more frequently after that. Could I clean the kitchen after breakfast? Could I vacuum the upstairs hallway? Could I wipe down the bathrooms? Each request was framed as a small favor. Something that wouldn't take long. Something I should be happy to do since I wasn't paying rent. And I did them. I cleaned and vacuumed and scrubbed, thinking I was just being helpful, earning my place in their home. But within a month, the requests had become demands. Amanda stopped asking nicely. She'd leave me lists of chores in the morning, clean all 6 bathrooms, vacuum every room in the house, do the laundry, scrub the floors, tend the garden. These weren't small favors anymore. These were full-time housekeeping duties. I was working 6 or 7 hours a day just doing household chores for them. When I tried to push back gently, Amanda's tone changed. She said I was living there for free, that the least I could do was earn my keep, that they were being generous by giving me a place to live, that I should be grateful, not complaining. She made me feel guilty for even questioning the arrangement, like I was being ungrateful and entitled. So I stopped pushing back. Just did what was asked. Richard backed up his wife completely. When I tried talking to him about the amount of work I was being asked to do, he was cold about it. He said I wasn't contributing rent or utilities or food costs, that I was basically a freeloader living off his generosity, that doing some household chores was the least I could do to earn my place. He said if I didn't like the arrangement, I could leave any time. But we both knew I had nowhere else to go. The work increased steadily. Amanda had me doing everything their housekeeper used to do. They'd actually let their housekeeper go shortly after I moved in. Why pay someone when they had free labor living with them? I was cleaning the entire 8-bedroom house, all 6 bathrooms, doing laundry for a family of 5, preparing meals, washing dishes, maintaining the garden. It was exhausting work for a 68-year-old man. Richard's 3 children were teenagers when I moved in. They'd been taught to respect me at first, but they quickly picked up on their parents' attitude toward me. They started treating me like hired help rather than their uncle. They'd leave messes expecting me to clean them, drop dirty clothes on the floor knowing I'd do their laundry. They stopped saying please or thank you, just issued orders like I was their servant. The children would make comments about me within earshot, talking about how I'd failed in life, how I'd never made anything of myself, how I was so poor I had to live with relatives and work for my room and board. Their parents encouraged this attitude. Richard would use me as a cautionary tale, tell his kids to study hard and work hard so they wouldn't end up like uncle, so they wouldn't be poor and dependent, so they wouldn't have to clean other people's houses to survive. Amanda started referring to me as the help when talking to her friends. She'd have ladies over for lunch and I'd be serving them. She'd introduce me as my husband's brother who helps around the house. Not as family, as help. Her friends would look at me with pity or contempt. Some would make comments about how nice it was that Richard and Amanda were charitable enough to give me work, like I was some charity case they'd taken pity on. I wasn't allowed to eat meals with the family anymore after the first month. Amanda said it was awkward having me at the table when I was essentially staff. She set up a small table in the kitchen where I'd eat alone after serving them their food. I'd cook their meals, set the table, serve them, then eat by myself in the kitchen while they enjoyed family time in the dining room. I was being excluded from the family I'd thought I was joining. Richard stopped introducing me as his brother when his business associates came over. He'd either not introduce me at all or refer to me as someone who takes care of the house. I'd be cleaning or serving drinks, and his important guests would look right through me. Like I was furniture, like I didn't matter, like I wasn't even a person worth acknowledging. Richard seemed embarrassed by my existence, ashamed that his brother had ended up poor and dependent. The isolation was crushing. I had no friends in the area. I'd moved from my hometown where I'd had connections from 40 years at the library. Here, I knew nobody except Richard's family, and they treated me like a servant. I couldn't afford to go anywhere or do anything. I had no income, no money of my own. I was completely dependent on Richard and Amanda for everything. Food, shelter, even basic necessities. I was trapped. I thought about leaving many times during those first few months. But where would I go? I had no job, no savings left, no friends who could take me in. I was 68 years old, too old to start over, too poor to afford anything on my own. Social Security wouldn't be enough to rent even a small apartment. I was stuck, trapped in a situation where I was being exploited and humiliated but had no viable alternative. About 3 months into living with Richard, the ultimate humiliation came. Amanda announced at breakfast that I'd be taking over all toilet cleaning duties. Not just the downstairs bathroom I'd been using. All 6 bathrooms in the house. The master bathroom, the 3 children's bathrooms, the 2 guest bathrooms, every single toilet in the 8-bedroom estate. She said this while looking me directly in the eyes, waiting to see if I'd object, daring me to complain. I felt my face burn with shame. Cleaning toilets is degrading work. Necessary work, but degrading nonetheless. At 68 years old, I was being told to scrub toilets for my own family, for my younger brother who'd supposedly taken me in out of kindness, for his wife who treated me like dirt, for their children who laughed at my poverty. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. They were literally making me clean up their shit. But I couldn't refuse. I had nowhere else to go, no money, no options. So I just nodded, said I'd take care of it. Amanda smiled with satisfaction. She knew she'd broken me, knew I'd accepted my place at the bottom of their household hierarchy. From that day forward, I was the toilet cleaner, the lowest position in their home, the person who did the work nobody else wanted to do. Amanda made sure I understood exactly what was expected. She showed me where the cleaning supplies were kept, explained how she wanted each bathroom cleaned, toilets scrubbed inside and out, floors mopped, mirrors wiped, counters cleaned, She wanted everything spotless. She said she'd be checking my work, that if it wasn't up to her standards, I'd have to do it again. She spoke to me like I was a child. Or worse, like I was an employee she was training. The work itself was physically hard. Getting on my knees to scrub toilets at 68 wasn't easy. My joints hurt, my back ached. I'd spend hours in bathrooms scrubbing and cleaning. The chemical smell from the cleaning products made me nauseous. My hands would get raw from the work, but I did it, every day, sometimes multiple times a day if the family made messes. I became intimately familiar with every toilet in that house. Richard's children found my new role hilarious. They'd make jokes about it constantly, call me the toilet man, make comments about how I'd finally found my calling. They'd deliberately make messes in the bathrooms knowing I'd have to clean them. Pee on the floor, leave toilet paper everywhere, splash water around. Then they'd laugh when I'd have to come clean it up. Their parents never stopped this behavior, never told them it was cruel. In fact, Richard and Amanda seemed to encourage it. Amanda would have her friends over for lunch or tea. She'd make sure to mention within my earshot that I was responsible for cleaning all the toilets. Her friends would look at me with a mix of pity and contempt. Some would make comments about how generous Amanda was to give me work, to let me earn my keep. They spoke about me like I wasn't even there, like I was a piece of furniture that happened to clean toilets. The humiliation was constant and intentional. Richard started bringing business associates home more frequently. He'd give them tours of his estate showing off his wealth. When they'd pass by while I was cleaning a bathroom, he'd make comments. Sometimes he'd introduce me as my brother who takes care of the house. Other times he'd say, "This is the help." Never just my name, never with respect, always emphasizing my lower status. His colleagues would nod politely and move on. Nobody cared about the old man scrubbing toilets. The worst part was how matter-of-fact it all became. At first I'd felt intense shame every time I cleaned a toilet, but after months of doing it daily, the shame became background noise. I'd be on my knees scrubbing and I'd think about how I'd ended up here. How at 68 years old this was my life, cleaning toilets for family members who saw me as less than human. The degradation became normal, expected, just part of my daily routine. Amanda would inspect my work randomly. She'd come into a bathroom right after I'd cleaned it, run her finger along surfaces looking for dust, check inside the toilet bowl. If she found anything less than perfect, she'd call me back to redo it. She'd speak to me in a condescending tone, tell me I needed to do better, that this wasn't acceptable, that if I couldn't handle basic cleaning, maybe I should find somewhere else to live. The threat was always there. Do the work perfectly or lose your home. Richard used my situation as a teaching tool for his children. He'd bring them into conversations about work ethic and success. He'd say things like, "See what happens when you don't apply yourself? You end up like Uncle cleaning toilets because you have no other options. That's what happens when you make poor life choices." His children would nod seriously. Absorb the lesson that poverty equals failure. That people who clean toilets are there because they deserve to be there. I'd hear them talking about me when they thought I couldn't hear. Amanda would tell her friends I was lazy, that I'd never worked hard enough to succeed, that she and Richard were doing charity by letting me live there. Richard would tell his business partners he was supporting his failed brother out of family obligation, that it was a burden, but someone had to help the poor. They'd rewritten the narrative to make themselves heroes and me a grateful charity case. The children would bring friends over. Those friends would see me cleaning, ask who I was. The children would explain I was their uncle who'd failed in life, who was so poor he had to live with them and work for his room. The friends would look at me with that same mix of pity and contempt I'd seen from adults. Even teenagers were learning to look down on me, to see me as a cautionary tale, as someone who'd failed and deserved his low position. At 68 years old, I was scrubbing toilets for people who'd been my family, people who should have loved and respected me. Instead, they'd turned me into their servant, their example of what not to become, their unpaid laborer who existed to make their lives more comfortable. I'd wake up every morning knowing my day would involve getting on my knees to clean up after people who saw me as worthless. The psychological toll was enormous. I'd spent 40 years as a respected librarian. People had valued my work. Children had loved the programs I ran. Community members had appreciated the services I provided. I'd had dignity, purpose, respect. Now I was a toilet cleaner. The lowest position in a household that treated me like garbage. The transformation from valued community member to family servant was complete and devastating. But I endured it, day after day, month after month, cleaning their toilets, taking their abuse, accepting their contempt, because I thought I had no other choice. Because they'd convinced me I was lucky to have what I had, that being treated like dirt was better than being homeless, that cleaning their toilets was the best I deserved. This nightmare went on for 5 years. 5 years of cleaning their toilets, 5 years of scrubbing their floors, 5 years of doing their laundry and cooking their meals and being treated like I was nothing. 5 years of daily humiliation that became my normal life. I was 68 when I moved in. I was 73 by the time everything changed. 5 years is a long time to endure systematic degradation by your own family. Each year Richard's business grew more successful. Each year his wealth increased. Each year his contempt for my poverty deepened. He'd talk about his latest real estate deals at dinner, millions of dollars in transactions, huge profits, new properties. His success was constantly growing. Meanwhile, I was in the kitchen scrubbing dishes and pretending not to hear. The contrast between his rising fortune and my servant status became more stark with each passing year. Amanda's treatment of me got worse as time went on. At first, she'd at least pretended to be polite, used please and thank you sometimes. But by year 3, she'd stopped bothering with basic courtesy. She'd snap orders at me, point at things that needed cleaning without even speaking, treat me like a dog she was commanding. I wasn't worth full sentences anymore, just gestures and harsh tones. I'd become less than human in her eyes. The children grew from teenagers into young adults during those 5 years. They all went to expensive private colleges that Richard paid for. They'd come home during breaks and summers. They'd revert to treating me like the family servant, leave their laundry for me to do, make messes expecting me to clean up. They'd bring friends home from college. Those friends would see their family's live-in servant, would ask questions about me. The children would explain I was their uncle who'd failed in life, who cleaned their toilets because I had nowhere else to go. Richard used me as a cautionary tale constantly with his children. He'd have serious conversations with them about their futures, about the importance of success and money. He'd say things like, "You see what happens when you don't apply yourself? You end up like Uncle, 68 years old with nothing, no money, no home, no dignity, reduced to cleaning other people's toilets because you made poor life choices." The children would nod seriously. Learn the lesson that poverty equals personal failure, that people like me deserved our low positions. Richard's oldest daughter graduated college and got a job at his company. She'd come home and talk about her entry-level position. She was making $60,000 a year to start, more than I'd ever made in my life. She'd mention her salary casually at dinner while I was serving food, not trying to brag, just stating facts. She had no idea that her starting salary was more than my peak earnings after 40 years of work. The casual mention of her wealth while I stood there as a servant was its own kind of cruelty. The middle child, Richard's son, was studying business. He'd come home talking about his classes, about investment strategies and real estate development. Following in his father's footsteps, Richard was grooming him to take over the business eventually. They'd have long conversations about money and success. I'd be cleaning the room while they talked, invisible, unimportant, just background noise while they discussed their bright futures. The youngest daughter was studying pre-law. She wanted to be an attorney. Richard was proud of all his children. Proud they were successful. Proud they'd learned to value money and achievement. Proud they'd learned not to end up like their uncle. I'd become the family's example of failure, the cautionary tale parents use to motivate their children. Work hard, or you'll end up like that pathetic old man cleaning our toilets. I never complained during those 5 years, never fought back, never argued when they gave me orders. I just quietly did the work, cleaned their toilets, scrubbed their floors, did their laundry, cooked their meals, maintained their garden, worked 6 or 7 hours every single day keeping their enormous house clean. My body ached constantly. My hands were permanently rough from cleaning chemicals. My knees hurt from kneeling to scrub. But I kept working, kept enduring, kept silent. Richard's wealth continued to grow exponentially. He bought a vacation home in the mountains, then a beach house, 2 additional properties just for vacations. He bought a boat, expensive artwork. He remodeled parts of the mansion. Everything in their life got more luxurious while I stayed the same. A servant working for room and board. My position never improved. My treatment never got better. I was stuck in the same degrading role year after year. Amanda would host charity events at the house. Rich women would come over to discuss raising money for various causes. They'd sit in the living room I'd just cleaned, discussing how to help the less fortunate. Meanwhile, I'd be serving them tea and cookies. The irony was lost on all of them. They wanted to help poor people in the abstract. But they treated the actual poor person in the room like he was invisible. Like helping me would never occur to them because I was just the help. Richard joined exclusive business clubs, made connections with powerful people. His social circle expanded to include local politicians and wealthy business owners. He'd bring these important people home sometimes, show off his mansion, his success, his perfect family. I'd be there cleaning, serving drinks, opening doors, part of the backdrop that demonstrated his wealth. Important people don't have live-in servants unless they're truly successful. I was proof of Richard's status, evidence he'd made it to the top. The family went on expensive vacations multiple times a year. Europe, Asia, Caribbean islands. They'd be gone for weeks at a time. During those periods, I'd stay home and maintain the house, clean it thoroughly, make sure everything was perfect for their return. I wasn't invited on vacations, obviously. I was staff. Staff doesn't vacation with the family. I'd be alone in that enormous house cleaning rooms nobody was using, preparing for their return, ready to resume my servant duties. They assumed I had nowhere else to go. Assumed I had no options, no money, no plan, no power. They thought I was completely dependent on their charity, that I'd endure anything to keep a roof over my head, that the fear of homelessness at my age would keep me compliant and submissive. They were right in a way. I did endure everything. I did stay compliant and submissive. But not for the reasons they thought. I watched them carefully during those 5 years. Watched how they treated people they saw as beneath them. Watched how they valued money over human dignity. Watched how they'd taught their children that wealth equals worth, that poverty equals failure, that people who serve are less than people who are served. I watched them reveal their true characters day after day, month after month, year after year, and I took notes, mental notes, about exactly who they were when they thought nobody important was watching. Richard's real estate empire was built on being ruthless, on taking advantage of opportunities, on exploiting weaknesses. He'd brag about deals where he'd gotten properties for pennies on the dollar from desperate sellers, about developments that displaced poor communities, about maximizing profit regardless of social cost. He was proud of his ruthlessness, saw it as business savvy. His family admired it, saw it as strength. They'd learned to be like him, hard, cruel, focused only on their own benefit. 5 years of watching, 5 years of enduring, 5 years of being treated like garbage by people who should have loved me. 5 years of cleaning toilets for family members who saw me as a cautionary tale rather than a human being. 5 years of systematic humiliation that they assumed I'd accept forever because I had no other choice. They were wrong about that. I had choices. I'd always had choices. But they'd revealed themselves so completely during those 5 years that I knew exactly what needed to happen. They'd failed a test they didn't know they were taking, and the consequences were going to be severe. What Richard and his family never knew was the truth about my financial situation. They assumed I was poor because I'd failed in life, because I'd made bad choices, because I'd spent 40 years in a low-paying job and had nothing to show for it. They thought my poverty was proof of my inadequacy, evidence that I was less than them, that their wealth made them better people. But they were completely wrong about everything. I wasn't poor because I'd failed. I was living like a poor person by choice. For 40 years I'd been living far below my means, taking that modest librarian salary and spending as little of it as possible. Living in a small apartment when I could have afforded better. Driving an old car when I could have bought new. Shopping at discount stores when I could have shopped anywhere. Every dollar I didn't spend on living expenses went somewhere else. Into investments. I'd started investing in my 20s. Nothing fancy. Just basic index funds and blue-chip stocks. Boring investments that grew steadily over time. I'd read books about compound interest, about how money grows when you leave it alone to accumulate, about how time in the market beats timing the market. So I invested consistently, every month, every year, for 4 decades. Small amounts at first, larger amounts as my salary increased slightly over the years. The magic of compound interest over 40 years is staggering. Money doubles every 7 to 10 years on average in the stock market. That means 40 years gives you multiple doublings. $1,000 becomes $2,000, then $4,000, then $8,000, then $16,000. The growth accelerates exponentially. What starts as modest savings becomes substantial wealth given enough time. But my investing wasn't just from my librarian salary. There was another source of money that Richard knew nothing about. Our grandmother. She'd been a careful woman who'd saved throughout her life. She'd invested wisely. By the time she died, she had a considerable estate. About $800,000. Not a fortune, but substantial. And she'd left all of it to me. Every single dollar. Richard got nothing from her will. Grandmother had seen something in Richard even when he was young. She'd seen his greed, his selfishness, his focus on money over people. She'd watched him grow into someone who valued wealth above everything else. She didn't trust him with her money, didn't think he deserved it, so she'd written her will leaving everything to me, the responsible grandson, the one who worked with books and children, the one who seemed to value things other than money. Richard never knew about grandmother's will. She died when we were in our 30s. He'd assumed her small estate got split between us or went to our parents. He'd never asked questions, never looked into it. He'd been too busy building his real estate empire to worry about an old woman's modest savings. So he had no idea I'd inherited $800,000. No idea that inheritance had been invested and growing for decades, that $800,000 became the foundation of my wealth. Added to my own consistent investing, it created a substantial portfolio. By the time I was 40, I had over $1 million invested. By 50, it was $3 million. By 60, it was $7 million. When I lost my job at 68 and moved in with Richard, I had approximately $10 million in various investment accounts. After 5 years of living with him, that amount had grown to $12 million. $12 million. That was my net worth. While I was scrubbing their toilets. While Amanda was calling me worthless. While Richard was using me as a cautionary tale for his children. While they all assumed I was a poor failure with nothing. I had $12 million sitting in investment accounts they didn't know existed. I was actually wealthier than Richard. His real estate empire was impressive, but much of it was leveraged, financed with debt. My $12 million was free and clear. No mortgages, no loans, pure accumulated wealth. I'd never told anyone about my investments, not my ex-wife. Not friends, not co-workers, certainly not Richard. I'd lived modestly my entire life, kept my wealth secret. Why? Because I'd seen what money did to people, how it changed them, how it made them treat others differently. I'd watched Richard become increasingly obsessed with wealth and status, watched how his success made him cruel and arrogant. I'd decided early on that I didn't want money to define me. Living below my means while secretly wealthy had given me freedom. Freedom to work a job I loved even though it didn't pay much. Freedom to help library patrons without worrying about profit. Freedom to live a simple life focused on books and learning rather than accumulation and status. The money was there as security, as a backup plan. But it wasn't my identity. It didn't control my choices or change who I was. When I lost my job at 68, I could have retired comfortably anywhere I wanted. I had $12 million. I could have bought a nice house outright. Traveled, lived in luxury. But I'd been curious about something. Curious about how Richard would treat me if he thought I was desperate and poor. Curious whether blood meant anything to him, whether he'd help family out of genuine love, or if his wealth had made him someone who only valued money. So when Richard offered to let me live with him, I'd accepted. Not because I needed his charity, but because I wanted to see who he really was. Wanted to test him. Wanted to know if my younger brother had any decency left, if family meant anything to him, if he'd treat a desperate relative with kindness and respect. I'd walked into his house with $12 million in the bank. But I'd pretended to be destitute, pretended to have nothing, pretended to be completely dependent on his generosity. The first few weeks had been a test. When Amanda started asking me to do chores, I'd complied, wanting to see how far they'd take it. When the requests became demands, I'd kept complying. When they started treating me like a servant, I'd accepted it. All the while watching, observing, taking mental notes about exactly who they were when they thought they had power over someone helpless. I could have left at any time, could have walked out, bought myself a beautiful home, lived in comfort, but I'd stayed, endured 5 years of humiliation. Why? Because I'd wanted to give them every possible chance to show basic human decency. Wanted to see if they'd ever treat me with kindness, if they'd ever recognize that I was family, regardless of my perceived poverty. If money was really all they cared about. They'd failed the test spectacularly. 5 years of chances, 5 years of opportunities to show compassion, 5 years when they could have treated me like a human being. Instead, they'd treated me like garbage, made me scrub their toilets, used me as their example of failure, taught their children that poor people deserved contempt. They'd revealed themselves completely, shown me exactly who they were at their core. And all the while I'd been sitting on $12 million, working as their servant while being wealthier than they'd ever be, cleaning their toilets while having more money in the bank than Richard had in liquid assets. Being called worthless by people who had no idea what I was actually worth. The irony was delicious, but also sad. Sad that my own family cared so little about me that they'd treat me terribly just because they thought I was poor. Their cruelty had shown me something important. They didn't value people. They valued money. They didn't love family. They loved status. They weren't good people who happened to be wealthy. They were people whose wealth had revealed their ugliness, and they'd taught their children to be just like them. Shallow, cruel, focused only on money and status. They'd failed as human beings in every way that mattered. Now it was time for them to learn the truth. Time for them to understand exactly what their cruelty had cost them. Time for the consequences of their 5-year test failure to become clear. I'd endured enough, learned enough, seen enough. The experiment was over, and the results were about to be revealed. Last month, everything changed. I was 73 years old. I'd been living with Richard for 5 years. It was a Tuesday morning around 10 o'clock. Amanda had given me my usual list of chores for the day. Clean all 6 bathrooms, do 3 loads of laundry, vacuum the upstairs, mop the kitchen floor. Standard tasks I'd been doing for years. I'd started with the bathrooms like I always did, working my way through the house one at a time. I was in Richard and Amanda's master bathroom, on my knees, scrubbing their toilet. The chemical smell from the cleaning products was strong. The bathroom was large and luxurious. Marble counters, walk-in shower, soaking tub, everything expensive and perfect. I was focused on scrubbing, making sure every part of the toilet was spotless. Amanda would inspect it later. If it wasn't perfect, I'd have to do it again. So I always made sure to do thorough work. That's when the pain started. A sudden crushing sensation in my chest, like someone had reached inside and squeezed my heart. I'd never felt anything like it before. The pain was intense, overwhelming. I dropped the toilet brush, put my hand to my chest, tried to breathe but couldn't get enough air. My left arm started tingling, going numb. I knew these symptoms. I was having a heart attack. I tried to call out for help, tried to yell Amanda's name, but I couldn't get enough breath to shout. The pain was getting worse, spreading from my chest down my arm and up into my jaw. I felt dizzy. The bathroom started spinning. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't support me. I collapsed onto the marble floor. The cold tile pressed against my face. I could smell the cleaning chemicals, could see the toilet I'd been scrubbing. This was where I'd collapse, on the bathroom floor where I'd spent 5 years working as a servant. I don't know how long I was on that floor before Amanda found me. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. Time stopped meaning anything. The pain was all-consuming. I was conscious, but barely. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and labored. Each breath was a struggle. I thought I might die right there, on their bathroom floor, surrounded by the cleaning supplies I'd been using to scrub their toilet. What a way to go. What a terrible ending. Amanda walked in eventually. She'd probably been wondering why I wasn't done yet, why the bathroom was taking so long. She saw me on the floor. For a second, she just stood there, looking at me like I was an inconvenience, like I'd made a mess she'd have to deal with. Then she seemed to realize something was seriously wrong. She pulled out her phone, called 911. Her voice sounded annoyed more than concerned, like this was disrupting her day. I heard her talking to the emergency operator, saying her brother-in-law had collapsed, that he appeared to be unconscious. She gave the address, answered their questions, but her tone was flat, clinical. No emotion, no fear, just irritation at the situation. She didn't kneel down next to me, didn't try to help, didn't offer comfort. She just stood there waiting for the ambulance to arrive, still looking at me like I was an inconvenience. The paramedics arrived maybe 10 minutes later. Amanda led them upstairs to the master bathroom. They found me still on the floor, still in pain, still struggling to breathe. They immediately started working on me, checking my vital signs, putting an oxygen mask on my face, asking me questions I could barely answer. They determined I was having a heart attack, said they needed to get me to the hospital immediately. They got me onto a stretcher, carried me downstairs and out to the ambulance. Amanda followed them down, but she didn't ride in the ambulance with me. She said she'd follow in her car, but I never saw her at the hospital. The paramedics loaded me up and drove away, sirens blaring, racing to the emergency room. I was alone with strangers while having a heart attack. My family didn't care enough to ride with me, didn't care enough to hold my hand, didn't care enough to offer comfort while I thought I might be dying. The hospital was a blur. Emergency room doctors and nurses working on me, tests and scans, an operating room where they did an emergency procedure to open blocked arteries. I have vague memories of it all. Nothing clear, just impressions of lights and voices and pain. I survived. The doctor said I was lucky. Another 30 minutes and I probably would have died. The blockage had been severe. They'd inserted stents to keep my arteries open, said I'd need to make lifestyle changes, reduce stress, take medications, follow up regularly. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering, 2 full weeks. The first few days were in intensive care. Then they moved me to a regular room. I was weak, tired, in pain from the procedure, but alive. I expected visitors. Expected Richard or Amanda or their children to come see me, to check if I was okay, to show some concern for their family member who'd nearly died. But nobody came, not once in 2 weeks. The nurses would ask if I had family. I'd say yes. They'd ask if anyone was coming to visit. I'd say I didn't know. They'd look at me with pity. An old man alone in a hospital bed with no visitors, no flowers, no cards, no phone calls, nothing. My family knew I was there. The hospital had called them, kept them updated on my condition. But they didn't care enough to visit, didn't care enough to check if I'd survived. Richard texted Amanda at one point. I know because a nurse accidentally showed me a message that came through on my phone. They'd given me my phone from my belongings. Richard's text to Amanda said, "Let me know when the old man is released. We need to figure out who's going to clean while he's out of commission." Not asking how I was, not expressing concern, just worried about who'd do the housework while their free labor was in the hospital. That's what I meant to them. Free labor, not family, not a human being, just a servant who'd temporarily stopped being useful. Amanda texted back, complaining about having to hire temporary cleaning staff, said it was expensive, said she couldn't wait until I was recovered enough to get back to work. They were discussing me like I was a broken appliance that needed to be fixed, not a person, not family, not someone who just had a major medical emergency, just an inconvenience that was costing them money because they had to pay someone else to do what I'd been doing for free. The doctors cleared me to leave after 2 weeks. They gave me prescriptions for multiple medications, instructions for recovery, told me to take it easy for at least a month. No strenuous activity, no stress. Follow-up appointments scheduled. They asked where I'd be going after discharge. Did I have family to help take care of me during recovery? I said yes. But I knew the truth. Richard's family wouldn't take care of me. They'd expect me to take care of myself, to get back to cleaning their house as soon as possible. Nobody came to pick me up from the hospital. I had to arrange my own transportation, called a cab, got myself back to Richard's house. When I arrived, Amanda was there. She asked if I was feeling better. I said I was recovering. She said that was good. Then she handed me a list of chores that had piled up during my 2 weeks away. Said the house was a mess, that the temporary cleaners she'd hired hadn't done a good job, that I'd need to fix everything they'd done wrong. She expected me to start working immediately, despite just getting out of the hospital after a heart attack. During those 2 weeks in the hospital, I had a lot of time to think. Time to reflect on the past 5 years. Time to process what my family had done to me. Time to understand exactly who they were. I'd been lying in that hospital bed alone. No visitors, no calls, no concern for my well-being. Just texts between Richard and Amanda complaining about who'd clean their house while I recovered. That was the final piece of evidence I needed. I'd been testing them for 5 years, giving them chances to show basic human decency, opportunities to treat me like family regardless of my perceived poverty. They'd failed every single test. They'd treated me like garbage, made me clean their toilets, used me as their cautionary tale, humiliated me daily. And now, when I'd nearly died, they couldn't even visit me in the hospital, couldn't spare an hour to check if I was alive. They'd revealed themselves completely. So I made a decision lying in that hospital bed, a decision I'd been considering for years but hadn't fully committed to. I was going to disappear from their lives, not physically at first, but legally, financially. I was going to make sure that when I was gone, they'd get exactly what they deserved, which was nothing. Every single dollar I'd accumulated over 40 years would go somewhere other than to them. They'd spent 5 years showing me they didn't value me as a person. Now they'd learn the cost of that choice. I had my attorney's number in my phone. His name was Michael Patterson. He'd been handling my investments and estate planning for 20 years. He knew everything about my financial situation, knew about the $12 million, knew I'd been living with Richard while secretly wealthy. We'd discussed my will many times over the years, made updates as my portfolio grew. But now I wanted to make final changes. Changes that would ensure Richard got nothing. I called Michael from my hospital bed on day 3 of my stay. He answered immediately, asked how I was feeling. I told him about the heart attack, about being in the hospital, about my family not visiting. He wasn't surprised. He'd known what they were like. I told him stories over the years about how they treated me, about the toilet cleaning and the humiliation. He'd been waiting for me to decide what to do about it. I told Michael I wanted to finalize my will immediately, make it absolutely ironclad, ensure there was no way Richard or his family could contest it or get anything from my estate. Michael said he'd come to the hospital, bring the necessary paperwork. We'd update everything properly with witnesses, make it completely legal and unbreakable. He arrived the next day with a briefcase full of documents. We spent 2 hours going through every detail. Michael had prepared multiple versions of the will over the years, based on our discussions. Now we were making the final version, the one that would actually matter, the one that would determine where $12 million went after I was gone. I told Michael exactly what I wanted, every specification, every detail. He took notes, revised documents, printed new pages on a portable printer he'd brought. The core of the will was simple. Richard gets nothing, not $1, not 1 penny. His wife Amanda gets nothing. Their 3 children get nothing. None of them would inherit anything from my estate. They'd treated me like garbage for 5 years. They'd humiliated me. They'd made me clean their toilets while thinking I was worthless. Now they'd learn I'd been worth $12 million, and they were getting none of it. Instead, every single dollar would go to charity, specifically to causes that mattered to me. Literacy foundations that helped children learn to read. Library endowments that would keep public libraries funded and operational. Scholarships for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue education. These were causes I'd cared about my entire life. Causes that reflected my values. The money would help people who actually needed it, not rich people who'd treated me like dirt. Michael suggested we include a section explaining my reasoning. Make it clear why Richard was being excluded. I agreed. We wrote several paragraphs that would be read aloud when the will was read. Paragraphs explaining exactly what Richard and his family had done, how they'd treated me, what they'd revealed about themselves. I wanted them to hear in explicit detail why they were getting nothing. Wanted them to understand the consequences of their cruelty. The will specifically mentioned the toilet cleaning, mentioned how they'd made me scrub their toilets because I was poor, mentioned how they'd used me as a cautionary tale, mentioned how they'd treated me like a servant for 5 years, mentioned how they'd never visited me in the hospital after I nearly died. All of it documented in legal language that would be read to them after I was gone. They'd have to sit there and listen to their cruelty laid out in detail. I also included instructions that the will be read with all of them present. Not just Richard, his wife Amanda too. All 3 of their children. I wanted the entire family gathered to hear what their treatment of me had cost them. Wanted them all to understand simultaneously that they'd lost $12 million because of how they'd treated a poor relative. The shock would be greater if they experienced it together. The realization more devastating if they had to process it as a family. Michael made sure the will was completely uncontestable. We used language that anticipated every possible challenge, made my mental state clear, documented that I was of sound mind, had witnesses from the hospital staff sign and notarize everything, built in legal protections against any attempt to overturn my wishes. Richard could hire the best lawyers in the state, and they wouldn't be able to break this will. It was ironclad. We also set up the charitable distributions carefully, creating trusts that would manage the money, ensuring it went to legitimate organizations, making sure it would actually help people rather than being absorbed by administrative costs. Michael knew the best charitable foundations, organizations that were well-run and effective, organizations that would use the money properly. My $12 million would do real good in the world, would help real people who needed it, unlike Richard, who just wanted more wealth to add to wealth he already had. I told Michael one more important thing. I wanted him to record the will reading, video and audio. I wanted to see their faces when they learned the truth, when they realized what they'd lost. I knew I might not be alive to see it in person, but I wanted to know what their reactions would be. Michael hesitated, said that was unusual, but I insisted. It wasn't about revenge exactly. It was about justice, about consequences. They needed to face what they'd done, and I needed to know they'd faced it. Michael agreed to arrange it, said he'd set up cameras in his conference room, record the entire will reading. I could watch the footage before I died if I survived long enough. Or if I died first, he'd keep it for his own records. Either way, there would be documentation of the moment Richard's family learned they'd lost $12 million because of how they'd treated me. Documentation of their shock and horror and realization. We finalized everything over those 2 weeks I was in the hospital, signed all the documents, got everything notarized and witnessed, made copies, filed them with the appropriate legal authorities. By the time I left the hospital, my affairs were completely in order. My will was final. My estate was planned down to the last detail. Richard and his family would get nothing. Every dollar would go to charity, and they'd have to sit in a conference room and hear exactly why. Michael walked me through everything one final time before I was discharged. Made sure I understood and agreed with every decision. Asked if I wanted to make any changes. I said no. This was exactly what I wanted. This was justice, not revenge, justice. They'd treated me terribly because they thought I was worthless. Now they'd learn I'd been worth more than they'd ever be. And their cruelty had cost them everything. That felt right. That felt fair. Michael put his hand on my shoulder before leaving. Said he'd been my lawyer for 20 years. That he'd watched me build this wealth carefully and quietly. That he'd always wondered what I'd do with it. Now he knew. He said what I was doing was the right thing. That Richard didn't deserve my money. That people who treated family the way Richard treated me deserved exactly what I was giving them. Nothing. He promised to execute my wishes perfectly. To make sure every dollar went where I wanted it. To make sure Richard understood completely what he'd lost. I left the hospital 2 weeks after my heart attack with my affairs completely in order. My will was final. My estate was planned. My revenge was prepared. All that was left was for Richard and his family to learn the truth. To understand what their 5 years of cruelty had actually cost them. To realize the poor man cleaning their toilets had been richer than they'd ever be, and they were getting none of it. I returned from the hospital to Richard's house, and things went exactly as I'd expected. Amanda handed me a list of chores that had piled up. The temporary cleaning staff she'd hired hadn't met her standards. She wanted me to redo their work. I was supposed to start immediately despite just having had a major heart attack. Despite doctors telling me to rest for at least a month. Despite needing time to recover. None of that mattered to Amanda. She needed her house clean and I was the free labor. I told her I needed to rest per doctor's orders. She looked annoyed, said the house was a mess, said I could rest after I fixed what the temporary cleaners had done wrong. I repeated that I'd just had a heart attack, that I needed to take it easy. She actually rolled her eyes, said I was being dramatic, that cleaning wasn't strenuous, that I could manage a little light housework. She had no concept of what recovery from a major cardiac event required. Richard came home that evening. I tried talking to him about the situation, about needing time to heal, about the doctor's instructions. He was dismissive, said I looked fine, said heart attacks weren't that serious these days with modern medicine, said I could do light work while recovering. He made it clear he expected me to resume my duties as soon as possible. The 2 weeks without me had been expensive. They'd had to pay someone to clean. Now that I was back, they wanted their free labor operating again. I realized in that moment I was done. Completely done. I'd given them 5 years and a heart attack to show basic human decency. They'd failed at every turn, even now, even after I'd nearly died. They couldn't manage basic compassion, couldn't let me recover in peace. They still saw me as nothing but a servant, as someone who existed to make their lives more comfortable. That realization made my decision easy. I called Michael that night from my room, told him I was ready to move forward with the plan. We'd discussed various scenarios during my hospital stay, different ways I could disappear from Richard's life permanently, different ways to set up the dramatic revelation. We'd settled on something simple but effective. I'd leave. Just pack up and go. Let them think whatever they wanted about where I'd gone. Michael had arranged everything. He'd rented me an apartment across town under his firm's name. A nice place, nothing too fancy but comfortable. He'd also arranged for movers to come get my few belongings. Most importantly, he'd arranged the timing. I'd disappear from Richard's house. Then exactly 1 week later, Michael would contact the family. Tell them there was an urgent legal matter to discuss. Ask them all to come to his office. That's when the will reading would happen. The beauty of this plan was they'd assume I'd died. When a lawyer calls a family to his office for an urgent legal matter, it usually means someone's dead and there's an estate to settle. They'd come to the meeting expecting to hear about my death, expecting to discuss whatever small amount I might have left behind. They'd be preparing to deal with the inconvenience of disposing of a poor relative's meager possessions. They had no idea what was actually waiting for them. I packed my things 3 days after returning from the hospital. I didn't have much. Some clothes, some books, personal items, everything fit in 2 suitcases. The movers Michael sent took the suitcases to my new apartment. I left Richard's house early one morning while everyone was asleep, didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, just walked out the door at 5 in the morning, got into the car Michael had sent, left that place forever. I'd spent 5 years in that house, 5 years of systematic humiliation, 5 years of cleaning toilets and scrubbing floors, 5 years of being treated like worthless garbage by people who should have loved me. Walking out that door felt like being released from prison. The relief was overwhelming. I was finally free, free from their cruelty, free from their contempt, free from pretending to be helpless and poor. I could stop the act, stop the test. They'd failed. Now they'd face the consequences. Richard and Amanda discovered I was gone sometime that morning. My room was empty. My belongings were gone. I'd vanished. Amanda called my cell phone. I didn't answer. Richard called. I didn't answer. They left voicemails asking where I was. Their tone was more annoyed than concerned. They weren't worried about my safety. They were worried about who'd clean their house, who'd do their laundry, who'd scrub their toilets. I deleted the messages without listening to all of them. Over the next week, they tried calling several more times. Amanda sent texts. Richard sent texts. I ignored everything. Let them wonder, let them worry, let them assume whatever they wanted. Some of their messages suggested they thought I'd gone to a nursing home. Others suggested they thought I might have died somewhere. None of them sounded particularly concerned, just curious about what had happened to their free labor. Michael waited exactly 1 week before making contact. He called Richard's office, left a message with his secretary saying it was urgent legal business regarding Richard's brother. Richard called back within the hour. Michael was professional and vague, said there were important matters to discuss, that the entire family needed to be present. Richard's wife, all 3 children, everyone needed to attend this meeting. It was crucial. Michael wouldn't explain why over the phone, just insisted everyone come to his office. Richard agreed to the meeting. Michael could hear the resignation in his voice. Richard clearly assumed I'd died, that this was about settling my estate, that he'd have to deal with disposing of whatever little I'd left behind. Probably a few belongings, maybe some small debts, nothing significant. Just one final inconvenience from his poor brother. He told Michael the whole family would attend. They'd come to his office Friday afternoon. Michael called me after speaking with Richard, said everything was set up. The family would be at his office Friday at 3. The conference room was prepared. The cameras were installed and ready to record. The will documents were printed and organized. Everything was ready for the revelation. I just needed to wait 4 more days. 4 days until Richard and his family learned the truth. 4 days until they understood what their cruelty had cost them. Those 4 days were strange. I was living in my new apartment, comfortable, free, no longer pretending to be poor, no longer living as a servant, just being myself for the first time in 5 years. I could have left town, could have traveled, could have done anything. But I stayed. I wanted to watch the recording Michael would make, wanted to see their faces when they learned, wanted to witness the moment everything collapsed for them. I thought about what they'd be thinking during those days before the meeting. They'd be planning my cheap funeral probably, discussing what to do with whatever belongings I'd left behind, annoyed at having to deal with the logistics of a dead poor relative, maybe relieved they wouldn't have to pay for my medical care or living expenses anymore. They'd see my death as closing an unfortunate chapter. The poor brother who'd lived with them for 5 years, finally gone. They could move on with their wealthy lives. None of them had any idea what was actually about to happen. No idea that the poor man who'd cleaned their toilets had $12 million. No idea that every dollar was going to charity instead of them. No idea that their 5 years of cruelty was about to cost them a fortune. They'd walk into Michael's office expecting a simple estate matter. They'd leave destroyed, financially and emotionally destroyed. And I'd get to watch it happen. Friday arrived. 3 o'clock. The meeting time. I sat in my apartment imagining Richard and his family arriving at Michael's office, walking into the conference room, sitting down expecting bad news about my death, followed by quick discussions about my minimal estate. They'd be impatient, wanting to get this over with, get back to their important lives. They had no idea their lives were about to change forever. Michael had promised to call me immediately after the reading, to let me know how it went, to send me the video recording. I waited by my phone. The meeting was scheduled for 1 hour. By 4 o'clock I should know how they'd reacted, should know if justice had been served, should know if the 5-year test had taught them anything about their own cruelty. Michael called me at 4:15. The meeting had just ended. He sounded satisfied, almost amused. He said it had gone exactly as we'd planned. Better than we'd planned, actually. The shock on their faces had been more dramatic than he'd expected. He said he was sending me the video recording right now, that I needed to watch it, that it was everything we'd hoped for. I thanked him and hung up. Opened my email, waited for the video file to arrive. The file came through a minute later. It was large, high-quality video. I downloaded it to my laptop, opened it. The video showed Michael's conference room from a camera mounted on the wall. Good angle. You could see the whole table, all the chairs, everyone's faces clearly. Michael had done good work setting this up. The recording started a few minutes before the family arrived. Just an empty conference room waiting. Then the door opened. Richard walked in first. He looked annoyed, like this meeting was an inconvenience, like he had better things to do. Amanda followed him. She looked bored, already checking her phone, not paying attention. Their 3 children came in next, the oldest daughter, the son, the youngest daughter. All of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, like this was a waste of their valuable time. Michael greeted them professionally, shook hands with Richard, gestured for everyone to sit. They arranged themselves around the conference table, Richard at the head, Amanda next to him. The children spread out on either side. Michael sat at the other end with a folder of documents in front of him. He looked serious, professional, like a lawyer about to deliver difficult news. The family settled in, stopped talking, waited for him to begin. Michael started with formalities, thanked them for coming, said he knew this was difficult timing, offered his condolences for their loss. Richard looked confused for a second. Then understanding crossed his face. He assumed Michael was talking about my death, that I'd died, and this was about my estate. He nodded seriously, pretended to be sad. Amanda did the same, fake sadness for the cameras. The children looked appropriately somber, all of them playing their parts. Michael continued. Said there were important legal matters to discuss regarding the estate. That's when I noticed Amanda lean back in her chair, a slight smile on her face, like she was relieved this would be quick and easy. Just sign some papers, dispose of a few belongings, get back to her life. Richard looked similarly relaxed. This was just a formality, a minor inconvenience, nothing important. Then Michael opened the folder, pulled out the will documents, started reading. His voice was clear and formal. He read the opening section. The standard legal language about this being my last will and testament, about being of sound mind, about revoking all previous wills. Richard was barely listening, looking at his phone under the table. Amanda was examining her nails, bored. The children were staring off into space, none of them paying real attention. Michael reached the key section. His voice didn't change, still professional and formal. He read, I leave my entire estate valued at approximately $12 million to be distributed as follows. He kept reading, but I watched the family's faces. Watched the moment those words registered. $12 million. Their heads snapped up simultaneously. Richard's mouth fell open. Amanda's eyes went wide. The children looked confused, like they'd misheard. Richard interrupted. 12 million? That's impossible. My brother didn't have money. He was poor. He was living with us because he was broke. His voice was loud, aggressive, disbelieving. Michael stopped reading, looked at Richard calmly, said the estate had been professionally appraised, that the 12 million figure was accurate, that the documentation was all here if Richard wanted to review it. Richard just stared. His face was pale. He looked like he'd been slapped. Michael continued reading, listed the charitable organizations, every foundation, every library endowment, every scholarship fund, $12 million split between various worthy causes, none to Richard, none to Amanda, none to the children. With each organization named, I watched their faces change. Confusion turned to realization, realization turned to horror, horror turned to rage. They were starting to understand what was happening. Amanda spoke up. Her voice was shrill, panicked. Where's our share? Richard is his brother. We took care of him for 5 years. We deserve something. Michael didn't respond, just kept reading, listing charity after charity, dollar amounts, distributions, everything going to organizations that helped people, nothing going to the family sitting around that table. Amanda's face got red. Her hands were shaking. She looked like she might explode. Then Michael reached the explanation section, the part I'd written specifically for them. He read it word for word. To my brother Richard, who made me clean his toilets because I was poor, you get nothing. Richard's face went from pale to bright red. His jaw clenched. Michael continued. To Amanda, who called me worthless while I scrubbed your floors, you get nothing. Amanda made a choking sound, like she couldn't breathe. Michael kept reading. The whole explanation, every detail about how they'd treated me, the servant duties, the humiliation, using me as a cautionary tale, not visiting me in the hospital. All of it laid out in legal language that Michael read in his professional monotone. The family sat there frozen, listening to their own cruelty described back to them, realizing what it had cost them. $12 million. Gone. Because of how they'd treated a poor relative. The children started crying. The youngest daughter actually put her head down on the table, sobbing. The son looked angry, like he wanted to hit something. The oldest daughter just stared at Michael in disbelief, her face completely drained of color. They were watching their inheritance disappear, watching millions of dollars go to strangers instead of them, because their parents had treated me like garbage, because they'd been taught to see poverty as worthless. Richard stood up, started yelling, said the will was invalid, that I'd been mentally incompetent, that he'd contest this. Michael remained calm, told Richard to sit down, said the will was ironclad, that I'd been evaluated by multiple doctors who'd confirmed my mental competence, that witnesses had verified everything, that the documentation was flawless, that no lawyer in the country could break this will. Richard kept standing, kept yelling, but his voice was getting weaker. He knew Michael was right, knew he'd lost. Amanda was crying now, genuine tears, not fake sadness like when she'd entered. Real grief. Grief over losing $12 million, over realizing what her cruelty had cost. She kept saying, "We didn't know," over and over, like that was an excuse, like not knowing I had money justified treating me terribly, like it was okay to abuse poor people. Michael just watched her, said nothing, let her cry. Michael finished reading the will, closed the folder, told them copies would be mailed to their home, that the charitable distributions would begin immediately, that they had no legal recourse, that this meeting was concluded. Richard tried to argue, tried to demand another discussion. Michael stood up, walked to the door, opened it, made it clear they needed to leave. They sat there for another minute, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Finally they stood, filed out of the conference room. Nobody spoke. They looked destroyed, devastated, the reality sinking in that they'd lost $12 million, that the poor man they'd humiliated for 5 years had been richer than they'd ever be, that their cruelty had consequences, permanent, costly, devastating consequences. They left Michael's office in silence. The video showed them walking out. Then the conference room was empty again. I sat in my apartment watching that video, watching their faces as they learned the truth, watching the moment their lives collapsed. I felt satisfaction. Not happiness exactly, not joy. Just satisfaction that justice had been served, that they'd finally understood what they'd done, that consequences had arrived. They'd treated me like worthless garbage for 5 years. Now they knew what that had cost them. Everything. Michael sent me regular updates over the following weeks about what happened to Richard's family. The news wasn't good for them. Within days of the will reading, Richard's carefully constructed life started falling apart. He'd been counting on my inheritance, not consciously maybe, but he'd known I existed, known I was his brother, assumed that whatever I had would eventually come to him. $12 million was more than he'd imagined, but even a smaller amount would have helped. Now he was getting nothing. Richard's real estate business had been struggling for the past year. He'd made some bad investments, over-leveraged himself on properties that weren't selling. He'd been using personal credit to cover business expenses, hoping things would turn around, hoping for an influx of cash from somewhere. My inheritance would have solved his problems. $12 million would have saved his business, paid off his debts, given him breathing room. Without it, his company was doomed. The business collapsed within 6 months. Richard couldn't make loan payments, couldn't pay his contractors, couldn't cover operating expenses. His properties went into foreclosure. His creditors started suing. Everything unraveled quickly once the cash flow stopped. He had to declare bankruptcy, both personal and business. The real estate empire he'd spent 40 years building disappeared, all because he'd treated his poor brother like garbage and lost a $12 million inheritance that would have saved him. The mansion had to be sold. It was mortgaged heavily, more debt than equity. The bank foreclosed when Richard couldn't make payments. The family had to move out, had to downsize dramatically. They ended up in a small 3-bedroom house in a modest neighborhood. Nothing like the estate they'd lived in. No more 8 bedrooms, no more 6 bathrooms, no more pool or tennis court. Just a regular middle-class house that must have felt like poverty to them. Amanda had to get a job for the first time in 20 years. She'd been a stay-at-home wife living off Richard's wealth. Now she needed income. She found work as a receptionist at a dental office, making $40,000 a year. About the same as I'd made as a librarian. The irony was perfect. She'd looked down on my modest salary, called me a failure. Now she was making the same amount. Working a regular job like regular people. No more ladies' lunches, no more expensive shopping trips, just work and bills like everyone else. The children had to deal with their own consequences. The oldest daughter had been working at Richard's company. When the business collapsed, she lost her job. She'd never worked anywhere else. Had no real experience outside her father's firm. She struggled to find new employment. Eventually took a job making much less than she'd been earning. Her comfortable lifestyle disappeared. She had to move into a small apartment, drive an older car, live like the normal people she'd been taught to look down on. The son had to drop out of business school. Richard could no longer afford tuition. The son had to get a job to support himself. Found work in retail management. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would lead to the real estate empire he'd been expecting to inherit. Just a regular middle-class job. He'd been raised to believe he was special, destined for wealth and success. Now he was working retail like millions of other people, learning that he wasn't special at all. The youngest daughter finished her pre-law degree but couldn't afford law school. No money for tuition, no parental support. She took a job as a paralegal, making decent money but nothing like what a lawyer makes. Her dreams of becoming an attorney died because her parents had made me clean toilets. Because they'd lost $12 million that could have funded her education. She'd been taught that poor people deserved their poverty. Now she was learning what financial struggle actually felt like. Richard tried to contact me after the bankruptcy, left voicemails apologizing, saying he'd been wrong, saying he understood now, begging me to change the will, to give them something, anything, even a small portion of the $12 million would help them. I didn't respond, didn't return his calls. He'd had 5 years to treat me with basic decency, 5 years of chances to show he valued family over money. He'd failed completely. Now he was living with the consequences. Amanda reached out too, sent emails saying she was sorry, that she'd treated me badly, that she understood why I'd written them out of the will. But she said they were suffering now, that they'd lost everything, that surely I could forgive them, that family should help family. The hypocrisy was stunning. When I'd been poor, she'd said I wasn't their responsibility, that I needed to earn my keep. Now that they were struggling, she wanted family support. She got the same response Richard got. Nothing. Silence. The charitable organizations receiving my money sent me thank you letters. The literacy foundations were using the funds to buy books for underserved schools. The library endowments were keeping public libraries open and operational. The scholarships were sending low-income students to college. My $12 million was helping thousands of people, people who actually needed it, people who'd been born into poverty through no fault of their own, people who deserved opportunities despite not having money. The money was doing real good in the world. I lived comfortably in my apartment for another 5 years, managed my remaining investments, traveled a little, read books, volunteered at the local library. Did the things I'd always wanted to do without worrying about money. I was happy, genuinely happy for the first time in years. Free from Richard's family, free from their cruelty, free to be myself without pretending to be poor. I'd spent 5 years testing them. They'd failed. Now I was spending my final years living the comfortable life I'd always been able to afford. I thought about Richard sometimes, about his fall from wealth to middle-class struggle. Part of me felt bad. He was my brother. We'd grown up together. But then I'd remember the 5 years. Remember cleaning his toilets. Remember being called worthless. Remember him using me as a cautionary tale. Remember him not visiting when I nearly died. The sympathy would disappear. He'd made his choices. Now he lived with them. Because I was poor, my family made me clean their toilets for 5 years. They humiliated me daily. used me as their servant, treated me like worthless garbage. They assumed I'd endure it forever because I had nowhere else to go. But what they never knew was I had $12 million secretly invested for 40 years. I was testing them, testing whether they'd treat family with kindness regardless of wealth. They failed spectacularly. When I disappeared from their lives, their lawyer read my will. $12 million to charity. Nothing for them. Zero. The poor man who cleaned their toilets was richer than they'd ever be. Their contempt for poverty cost them everything. Their cruelty destroyed their comfortable lives. And I got to watch it all happen. Justice served. Consequences delivered. They learned too late that the person scrubbing their toilets had been worth more than they'd ever imagine. Their lives collapsed. Mine finally began.